raw and violent kind of story than the ones I had written up to that point. And what came out was the first draft of this novel. When I submitted it to him, he told me, this isn't long enough for me to publish. So I amplified it. I enlarged it, not by adding more episodes or nothing like that, but creating a second plot to intertwine with the first one. The first plot I created was that of the two men, and then I created the plot of the two women. Yeah. You didn't know that, George? No? Oh, well, okay. Well.
Oh, no, I didn't. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, that's what happened. But, funny thing for me, at least, was that when I finished this second draft of the novel, which was twice the size of the original one, and got in touch with my friend, he unfortunately was no longer an editor because publishing house had gone bankrupt. So I had to look for another publisher for this experiment, and unfortunately, I found one in Mexico. That's what happened.
Well, I'm surprised, or I guess interested that you started with the men's story, these two characters. Just as a reader and a reviewer, you're first confronted with the story of the two women, and that in some way seemed for me to ground what the story or the book was about. So that's really interesting. George, how, at what point did you come in as the translator? What is your relationship with it? How did you first come into contact with this book and decide to translate?
Well, I've been translating Alberto for quite a while. I think I've translated, I don't know how many dozens of short pieces by him. And so I don't remember when he sent me this, but I've had it in my possession for quite a while. And as you know, the way publishing goes in the United States, translators generally have to shop for a publisher. And I actually, believe it or not, the first publisher that was interested in this was McSweeney. And that was probably almost, I mean, more than 5 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, actually, or even longer. So I prepared I didn't want to translate the whole thing because I said we usually have to shop for our own publishers. And if you translate a work and can't find a publisher, you just have to sit on it. So I just translated initially enough to shop it. I also shopped it around to some fellowships and residency programs. But I thought it was an important work, and it needed to be like all of Alberto's work is. I mean, and I'm not just saying that to flatter him. I'm one of his biggest champions, at least in the United States, but I know he has other translators who are as enthusiastic about him as I am. But then I met Omar a few years ago, and Omar, I think about a little over a year ago, approached me about publishing this novel, this translation. And so it kind of began in earnest about a year ago. And so that's kind of its history. And I'm finally glad we got it out. But I'm like you, I'm also, story was the story between the two men. Like you, because it seems like it is actually grounded, as you said, in the plot between the two women, the two females. So I was equally surprised by that.
So it'll be interesting to talk to the other people in the discussion later about how they see that structure and see which relationship is maybe the prime relationship of the book. So the novel revolves around two men, Latour and Mundo, and two women, Marlene and Julius. And so I had the chance to reread the novel this past week, and I noticed so much more going on thematically and structurally. And there's the theme or the symbol of the door with the men. So the story starts with Latour opening the door, and the story ends with him closing the door. And with the women, it's with turning on the light and turning off the light at the end. And there's no chronological structure. Even within each individual unit, the storyline is falling back on itself. It sort of merges with the past and the present. And so I wanted to ask how that structure developed. Was that something that was there from the beginning, or was that something that you worked on after the story had already come to you, Alberto?
Well, I think I worked on that structure in some ways from the very beginning, because I was interested in creating a form for this story that didn't lend itself easily to be read as pornography or as some kind of pulp cheap fiction, so to speak, because I had decided early on some of the themes and some of the scenes I wanted to write about, and there are. It was easy, I thought, for that kind of book to be confused with something like that, because it deals with sex, it deals with violence, it deals with the power relations and the power hierarchies that appear in interpersonal relationships. So I distance myself from a kind of easy exposition. I try to make it to complicate it, at least to some extent, to see what else could I do with these themes and these characters. So when I made this first draft with only one storyline, there was already this this chronological time bending or going around itself. And in the end, the addition of the second storyline served me to ground it in some way, because I think it's more important than the first one, but also it's helped me to create more games, if I may say so, games with the narrative structure of the novel in general. So I really think that the process of revising and rewriting a first draft is very important for me as a writer, because many creative decisions come only until that stage in the process. So it was very much a crucial part of the writing in this case.
Okay.
Right, may I add something about the structure? I've actually found this novel very hard to translate because of that structure. I, as a rule, do not read before I translate. I translate as I'm reading. So by the time I got to the second story, and I was working in that, I was kind of plodding through my first draft, I became so detached from the first story because if a work is linear and you have the same, more or less the same characters going through each chapter, you develop a relationship with them. So you develop this personal relationship, and as a translator, they're constantly in the back of your mind. But because of the structure of this, I lost contact with those characters. And as I was plotting through the new storyline, the new plot, I almost forgot what was going on in the previous one. And then all of a sudden, I returned to it. And I'm like, oh, I'm back with these characters now. And then I realized that I lose contact with the other characters. And so I was constantly having to go back, which is actually something I do when I translate anything. Any translator will go back because they need to refresh their minds about something. But I constantly found myself going back to relearn, to become familiar again with these characters that I'd lost touch with. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, thank you.
But also, as I'm translating, because I've not read the entire novel, usually I'm hanging on, thinking what's next, what's going to happen next. And I think that was more true with this novel than anything else I've translated. I wanted to get to the end. I wanted to see how this turned out. And I don't know if I'm going to spoil anything, but you really kind of find out what the ending is in the middle. But then there's what happened before the end comes after that. But you've got to know that as well. I mean, the last page of this novel, I think it was the coolest thing in the world, because I wanted to know how it was going to at least end structurally, what was going to happen on the last page, let's call it that. And it was very surprising to me, but it was actually it's like, wow. So I'm being driven forward, compelled to go on because I want to know what is going on, but I have these interruptions moving between plot and plot. So anyway, whatever that's worth.
Oh, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That's insightful. I was going to ask you about your process of translating, because I know that you don't read the book before you begin translating.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry for stealing your thunder or your question.
Oh, no. That's quite all right. So another thing I wanted to ask you, Alberto, the relationships. I mean, we have this male relationship and this female relationship. Was that part of your attempt to make it seem less, I don't know, pornographic, or what was the intention behind having two very isolated relationships, the male relationship and the female relationship, and then of course how it merges?
Yeah, well, no, what I was trying to do was to, at least for myself, to create some kind of balance, of structural equilibrium, so to speak, with the novel as a whole. I had already the first relationship already written in the first draft, the male relationship, and then I thought, how can I balance, or how can I create something like a mirror image of that first storyline with another one, once I decided to create another one. So I thought, let's make this other relationship one between two women, between two females. And there are also several other traits of this relationship that are decided to reflect or to counterbalance the first one. For example, the two men live in, or I imagine them to live in Mexico City, or some rich Mexican city, and the two women live in a poor town in the border. Yeah. And the two men are well off, and Latour is like an upper crust individual from Mexican society who can get away with anything because of his power and money. And on the other hand, Marlene, who would be his counterpart, structurally speaking, she's a woman that lives on the fringes of society. So there are several elements in the characterization and the plots that counterbalance each other. I at some point I thought that the novel could be seen like the drawing of a butterfly. You have one storyline, you have the other, and you have a small main body that unites both. So you have that strange shape.
Okay. So let's talk about the novel's title. So in Spanish, it's The Slaves, and in English, The Most Fragile Objects. If either one of you or both of you could talk about why you decided to change the title in English, and then how you came up with what the new title would be.
Well, Alberto and I actually disagree on that, or misremember. He told me he did not want the title to be The Slaves, mainly because of what that connotes in American culture, more than anything else. And he invited me to look for another title, and I seem to remember him actually deciding on this. He says it was me. Alberto?
No. No, what you say is true. I remember suggesting you a few titles that came off the top of my head, but then you suggested The Most Fragile Objects, and that I really liked. So we ran with that, and I think it's a really good title.
Well, and so it's a line taken from the novel, and so I think it works well as well. And this is a great example. Sometimes titles turn out to be direct translations of the original, or some variation of the original, but sometimes a new title has absolutely nothing to do with no title. But this is a line that's taken from the novel, and I think it works very well.
I found myself, when I was rereading, looking for other phrases or other themes that might have been maybe something that you thought of as an alternate title yourself.
Did you find any? Did you decide on any?
I did. I marked them in the text, but I didn't think about collating, putting them together and reading my list of possibilities tonight.
I think
the
idea of fragility in that title moves somewhat the interpretation of the novel as a whole, but I think it moves those ideas in an interesting direction, because when I was writing the novel in Spanish, I was thinking mostly in the idea of trying to look behind this veneer of toughness or rawness in certain violent stories and violent fantasies, especially sexual fantasies. And what you find when you go beyond that facade is actually the fragility of human consciousness, of human identity. Many of our fantasies of power and violence conceal actually a conscience of our own fragility that we can hardly live with. We must conceal them in one way or the other just to keep living. So that's an underlying theme of the novel itself.
Yeah. So I wanted to maybe branch out a little bit. You've already alluded to other things Alberto has written that George has translated. And so I want to just briefly mention some of those things and maybe talk about how the process of writing and or translating these other texts between you two played out, and if they were different processes for both of you, or you approached them the same way. And I'm thinking specifically of what was it? The Asymptote published, was it earlier this year or last year, The Time Traveler, which is what we're now calling Twitterature or Twitteratura. So this novel composed entirely of tweets, and then also you have this other sort of quasi connection between with City X, which was a novel in 101 tweets published by Latin America Literature Today. And that was something that George's graduate students translated and then tweeted live on Halloween a couple of years ago. And so I want to know, I guess, Alberto, when you're writing a novel, a traditional novel or book, compared to this sort of new online genre, is the process for you as a writer the same, or what is different between those two things?
Oh, well, I think it's a very different process because when I'm writing online, I know I can try different approaches and different techniques, different phrasings very rapidly, and I can discard whatever attempts fall flat or don't come out as I expected. On the other hand, when I'm writing a more conventional project, I know I can correct or revise whatever I'm writing less in real time, with more leisure, with more time to spare. But I also know that once I decide that this word goes in and this other goes out, and when I decide this phrase should be structured that way, this becomes fixed. It's less fluid. It's much less fluid than the online publication. So there's different process for writing. There are different avenues for thoughts to make decisions. It's very different in many ways.
Okay. And George, then the process of translating those two different modes of writing, how do you approach that? Are you, as a translator, somehow more free, like Alberto was when doing the Twitterature?
Not really. The thing about translating Alberto is not just from a structural standpoint, but so much of Alberto's work is different. Each piece is very different. And one of the things I do like about translating him is especially that. I mean, there can be a lot of structural difference between what he writes. But as far as translating the Twitterature, please don't make me say that again. By the time I get it, even by the time I get it, it really has become kind of static, because it's been tweeted, or it's been, and actually it's tweeted first and then it's published second. So by the time I get it, he has, the final tweet, if he has edited anything online or deleted anything and gone back and fixed it, What I'm actually translating is the finished tweet. The difficulty, however, with the tweets is I had to also limit myself to the number of characters.
Right.
And that was very difficult. And in a lot of cases, I tried to get as close to the number of characters as possible. And so, I mean, I like anything about translation as a challenge. And there can be lots of challenges when you're limited by form. You know, there are all kinds of challenges that go into translation. But if you're challenged by the form, you know, that's a challenge that I love to accept. So in that case, well, for example, City X, as you said, it was going to be tweeted. The time traveler wasn't tweeted, and so I could have fudged with that. It was published in Asymptote. I could have made some of those tweets longer than, was that during the reduced characters or the new characters? Do you remember, Alberto? What was the original number of characters?
It was still 140 characters, yes.
Right. Okay. So I actually could have fudged it a little bit because I knew it was not going to be tweeted. And so I could have gone over the 140, but I would not allow myself to do that. So I saw that as a challenge. And then as far as City X is concerned, because it was going to be live tweeted, we had to make sure that we adhered to the number of characters. But you know, as you mentioned, one of my classes actually translated it, and we workshopped it in class, and Alberto actually zoomed in and worked with them. I mean, this is a project that they absolutely loved, but I had to make sure, I was the editor in that regard, I had to make sure that they stayed under the number of characters, but I also had to make sure, you know, I think there were, maybe 9 students working on it. I had to make sure that I was able to unify 9 different translators' voices. So that was an interesting project.
Did you have each student translate each tweet, or did they work in groups, or how?
I assigned each one of them a number of tweets. I think they all had 10 tweets, and then I translated the remainder of the tweets. And so they had to present their tweets or their translations in class. I conduct my translation class like workshops, and so I and the other students will critique their translations. And so in that way, each of the students was participating to some extent in the entire project.
So another translation question, we talked about the title of the novel. I was also curious about Latour and his name, because in the novel, in the Spanish, his name is Golo. And so I'm just curious how you arrived at Latour.
Well, I will take credit for that. Well, Alberto said, I don't want Golo. And I asked him to explain to me why. And Alberto, why did you say you didn't want Golo?
Yes, when the character that was named Golo was named because it was partly inspired in a short story I wrote many years ago when I was 20 or something. Some scenes or some inkling of the character that would become Latour was already present in that early story. And I kept the name for the Mexican edition of the novel, but around the time it was published, another book appeared by another author that had a character named the same way, and I felt really uncomfortable because of that. Also because some reviewers were pairing that novel with mine just because the characters were named the same. So I wanted to distance myself from that name, and and ask George to help me in that regard.
And I didn't know what to do. I wanted to try to find something that was close to Golo. I wanted to find something that was bisyllabic. And then I started doing some reading on S&M, and I don't know, I thought, well, you know what? Let's go to the master. Let's go to the Marquis de Sade. And I was doing some reading on the Marquis de Sade and saw that his servant's name was Latour.
Uh-huh.
So that's how I arrived at it.
Okay.
And it's bisyllabic, although the stress isn't the same, but I can live with that.
So George, how much fun did you have creating the glossary for the most fragile objects?
Well, first of all, that was one of the last decisions. I had actually translated, as you know, Frank, and some of our guests may know, I'm a big fan of foreignization. And so I'm constantly looking for ways that I can foreignize a text and leave as much of the foreign in it as possible. But I had already translated and most of this has to do with cursing and foul language and sexual language. And I had translated most of that. There was some of it that I knew that I could leave in the original. But I decided, and this is actually something experimental for me, I decided because these words, all the words that appear in the glossary, are so uniquely Mexican that I thought it would, and because cursing is so culturally specific, that to change those to any English equivalent, and there's no single English word that is equivalent to, because these are multi-layered words. They have so many different meanings. It would have been impossible to find an equivalent, which is what translators very often try to do. So I thought, you know what? I'm going to go and leave as many of these that are just so uniquely Mexican, so Mexican. I'm going to try to leave as many of these in the original as I can. And then it occurred to me, well, let's try a glossary. And so I approached Alberto first to see what he thought about it, and Omar, who is an absolute wonderful publisher to work for, and they said, sure, let's go for it. So I went through and I picked out all of the words, and all of them are necessarily curse words. There are some that are not, that are also just very uniquely Mexican. But some of them that might be already American audience, like the word for, like fonda, for example, Lonia, so there's, and some of these words they'll understand. And, any variation of the word chingar, lots of American readers can deal with that. But then I looked at it, as a project, but finding the actual translations or explaining these things, it's kind of like writing a dictionary. And I had a very good friend who is a professor at New Mexico State University, or actually maybe University of New Mexico. He'll kill me if I get it wrong. Rodrigo, who actually helped me tease out the nuances of all of these words. But I wanted to put it up front. So I wanted it to become part of the text. I wanted the reader to have to engage with it before they read. And then as they read the novel, they wouldn't have to thumb to the back to see what this word meant. They'd arts up front. And then as they read the novel, it was much easier for them to understand them, to take them on their own terms. And then hopefully, as I said in my introduction, then take them with them. One of the things that all say, but not all translators, I think, believe or practice, is that translation helps us to enrich the receptor culture. And so the idea that we are going to somehow receive part of the language or the culture that is being translated out of can only be real if you leave elements in the text that are foreign. If you domesticate everything, if you erase the foreign from it, then the receptor culture isn't learning anything about the other culture. And so by leaving words in the original, and the same thing with syntax, you know, I tried to not to mess with the syntax any more than I have to, because English is going to continue to be inflexible, which by and large English syntax is very inflexible. It's going to continue to be inflexible until we begin to push the limits of it. And by adhering or staying as close to the Spanish syntax or whatever the foreign syntax is, to help us push the limits of English syntax, but also push the limits of English lexicon.
Okay. Thank you. So I want to maybe start looking at questions that have been coming up in the chat. It's we have almost about 20 minutes left, so let's move in that direction. It asks, is there anything new that Alberto is working on that George is going to translate? Anything that you've already made? Well, maybe we have the answer from George's expression.
Hey,
but,
Tony.
Hi, Tony. I'll let Alberto talk about what he's working on. Let me just say this. Alberto is one of those writers that I can send him an email and say, this magazine wants something on this topic. Do you have anything? And he says, let me get back to you. And he always has something. I think Alberto is one of those writers who has a big drawer of work, or whether things that have been published or have even in the original, you know, but he always has something for me. So, and I look forward to translating anything from or by Alberto that I can. What are you working on, Alberto?
Wow, right now I'm working on a children's novel. So let's see what happens with that. And I don't know. I'm trying to finish also an adult novel that was finished before the COVID pandemic. But I think now it has to be revised somewhat because of the pandemic, because it has many contemporary elements. So I don't know when will that be ready to do the rounds in search of publishers. So
Alberto has another novel, and I'll say the English title, The Tower and the Garden, La Torre y el Jardín, which was a finalist for the Rómulo Gallegos Prize, which is one of the most prestigious prizes in the Spanish language, that I want to translate. And it's a big novel. If I take it on, it would be a year of my life at least. And I'm willing to do that. I'm just getting ready to finish my Patol novel right now. And so once I finish that, I'll need something to work on. So publishers,
please listen to us. And thank you in advance, dear George.
You're welcome.
So Ron is asking, George, as a professor, what's your sense of the next generation of translators?
Well, you know, really at the Middlebury Institute, we don't teach literary translation. I taught a course this semester, but we teach all that other boring kinds of translation, you know, things that you do at the UN and the World Health Organization and stuff like that. But I had a lot of good students. When I do teach literary translation, it is a language agnostic course. So we had students translating from about 10 different languages. And there was some really good work going on. I was very, and these are students who, as I say, they generally don't, they're not studying literary translation per se, but there was some good work going on. I think anyone who wants to do literary translation is very excited and about it because they love literature. And I think that that is very important, and they are big readers, which is also, what I tell any of my students in any translation course I teach, you're only as good a translator as you are a writer. So you'll never be a good translator if you don't write well. And I think that that's true, especially in literary translation. If you don't have some kind of literary sensitivity, you're not going to be a good literary translator. So hang in there, Ron. As long as I have anything to do with it, then they're going to be good, I hope. I was very pleased. I've only been at Miss, we call it Miss, for 2 years. And my first semester here, one of my students entered the World Literature Today student translation competition, which was a literary translation competition, and she won it. And so I was very excited about that. Awesome. And I have one student this summer who has already placed 3 translations, literary translations this summer. Wow. So yeah, I'm really excited about it.
So here's a question from Stephen. Alberto is fluent in English. I wonder if he has any thoughts about what might have been lost in the translation, in George's translation. Is there something that's maybe not lost, but have you read George's translation? And I don't.
Well, I think I wouldn't use the word lost. I think some things become, some things move around, so to speak, because it's translated. Right. Translations implies moving, displacement. So the simplest experience of hearing a Mexican word in the Mexican context is unavailable for anyone else outside of Mexico for obvious reasons. So the glossary that George created helps bridge somewhat the difficulty of having that experience outside its context, but it's in itself a different experience, a useful experience, I think, for an English language reader, because in that way he or she can have an idea, an approximation of what it means, a word like chingar, or a verb used in a very Mexican, very particular way. But in itself, that's a different experience. So I think that's what happens, and it's inevitable in any translation. But in itself, it's an interesting experience. I've discovered that translators can open oneself up as a reader, even if we don't translate ourselves, to a different knowledge of one's language, because they think about syntax, they think about etymology, they think about these underlying, not often visible structures and strictures in language. So reveal these hidden elements of language itself can be very stimulating for one as a reader.
One of the things that I am always concerned with, because there is some degree of kinds of loss, and the job or the task, to quote Benjamin, one of the tasks of the translator is to control loss and keep it as a minimum. But there's not just linguistic loss, there's cultural loss. So I'm always concerned about cultural loss, as and certainly there can be loss of meaning. There can be lots of different kinds of losses. but I'm always concerned about keeping that at a minimum. Daniel Hahn, who is an absolutely wonderful translator, wrote an article recently about translating curse words, which can be, there are certain elements of language that are very difficult to translate because there just are not any cultural equivalents. But if you do translate those words, if you translate the word pendejo, which can mean lots of different things, then there is a loss there. And so to minimize that, that was one of the reasons, pendejo occurs a lot in this text. But I mean, and that exists outside of Mexico, but it is just a very Mexican word. And so you can look in the glossary, you can see all the different possible meanings of pendejo. And then when you read it in the text, you get to decide which one of those meanings for yourself it is. I'm not making that decision for you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So Omar asks, when I read the novel in Spanish, the structure reminded me of Rayuela, the Julio Cortázar novel, Hopscotch, as you can, in that you can read it in a different order. And my confession is, when I reread the novel, I read section A, B, C, and D, and then the middle section at the end. And I can say that still it's not chronological. And still there's so many interesting twists of that narrative. And so Omar is asking, is this an intentional homage to Cortázar?
Oh, well, I do admire Hopscotch by Cortázar. I don't think it was a conscious homage. It was rather the fact that the Cortázar's writing, as well as Nabokov's or Milorad Pavic or several other writers who tend to play with form and structure, are very important for me as an influence in general. And I think constantly about that other levels of meaning aside from the plot itself when I'm writing.
I have an interesting suggestion. If this goes into a second edition, Alberto, you can come up with another order to recommend that the readers read it in. We can include that in the second edition.
Oh yeah, of course, like an operating manual.
Yes, exactly.
Right, and instructions, a set of instructions. Yeah, why not? Omar.
Here's a question from Cassie for Alberto. In the novel, you tell parallel stories of a woman who is born into sexual slavery and a bureaucrat man who chooses this role as a slave and is, against his will, finally replaced. These two characters never meet in the narrative universe you create, though their stories are in constant dialogue in the novel's readers. Can you talk a bit about this technique of setting up thematic resonances while avoiding narrative co-penetration? How did you hope the readers would experience these two stories working together? Hope I got that question out okay.
Okay, well, I think that resonance is one of the many effects you can achieve with plot and with parallel storylines in a level other than that of the plot itself, in the level of structure. And so I was very keen to try that with this project because of the way it came about, because I had to invent a new second part of the novel before publishing it. I decided I wanted to experiment and to try this other kind of effect that I hadn't used before in such a way. I think many structural effects are available for fiction writers than most of us think or use at any point in our career. So I think we're fortunate if we can experiment beyond what's conventional in terms of structure and plot, and I try to do it anytime I can.
Here's a question from Joshua. I'm wondering for both George and Alberto, whether a translation to you is a kind of reproduction of the original work or an expansion or continuation of it. Maybe in musical terms, is the translation a cover song or a further variation on a theme?
Wow. That's a great question.
It is a great question. It's something that I think about actually all the time. I have not come to a conclusion about what the role of the translator is, who the translator is, and what the translation is. I know some people have come to some very definitive conclusions about those two things, but I haven't. But I'm constantly thinking about it. I've been called, actually, Luis Jorge Boone called me his co-author, and a lot of translators like to consider themselves author. Am I the author of the translation? Yes. What is the translation in the relationship to the original? Is there even an original? Can we call Los Esclavos the original? All of that is now being problematized. I think it's probably being over-problematized because in academia, theorists love to complicate things. It's interesting reading, and there are interesting questions to ponder, but I don't think that I've come to anything definitive as far as that's concerned. I was just thinking actually about the musical analogy today. So let's say we have a composer who writes a song, and then it is, let's say it's for the violin, and it's played by, 10, 20, 30, 100 different violinists. What do those become? Are those translations? Is what the composer wrote the original? We call them performances, certainly with different interpretive perspectives. And so this is an analogy that has been used a lot in relation to translation to music. But I don't have any definitive answers, but I'm open to it. Alberto, what do you think?
Supporting what you said, George, I think at the very least, the translator is an arranger, in keeping with the music analogy. You can have the original composition, but then you have to arrange it for these or those instruments. And in many cases, it's common for a text to become improved by translation. And I'm open to that possibility. And I think it has happened in my work with George. So yeah, of course, because just because one is thinking twice or is thinking again about the same words once written before, and it also happens that those words or those phrases become like translated or pre-translated, in the sense that we see it from another vantage point when they are going to be moved into another language. So we think about them in another way. And that wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't had this opportunity to move them around from one territory to the next, so to speak.
Well, let me just say that Alberto is my favorite author to work with because he is so accessible. I can write Alberto an email, send him, actually he makes himself available on every social media platform. And, he's always willing to work with me, discuss things, and he never has a heavy hand at all. and he's open to any kind of discussion. And I see that our hostess is back.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the lovely conversation. Thank you, Alberto, for being here. Thank you, George, for being here. Thank you, Frank, for being here. Unfortunately, it is that time, y'all.
Oh, well.
But thank you so much for joining us for this virtual event. We hope that later on in the future, this can become an in-person engagement.
Thank you to all the attendees too. It was wonderful seeing so many familiar names, if not faces out there, and new names as well.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming.
And
Thank
Thank you,
you, everyone.
Jesse. Thank you, George, Frank.
thank you.
Thank
Happy
you,
to see you.
Alberto. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Be safe.